Sweating through a stiff linen shirt, Sarah fought to survive the South Carolina afternoon, where the humidity carried the thick, heavy tang of exhaust fumes and marsh mud. She was there for her kid brother, watching him receive his shiny new Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, while she hovered in the back, a proud civilian sister carefully hiding her ink and her scars. The masquerade held until Danny's commanding officer approached. When she reached out to greet him, her sleeve rode up just 2 inches. The blood drained completely from the colonel's face the moment his eyes locked onto the jagged ink on her forearm. The bleachers at Paris Island were a miserable, boiling crucible of cheap perfume, sunscreen, and misplaced patriotism. The South Carolina sun didn't just shine. It leaned on you. It was a wet, heavy, suffocating weight that carried the scent of low-tide salt marsh and melting asphalt. Sarah sat in the 8th row, wedged between a woman furiously fanning herself with a glossy program and a man whose cologne smelled aggressively like pine needles and alcohol. Her thighs stuck to the hot aluminum. The linen button-down she was wearing, a desperate, last-minute purchase from a strip mall department store, felt like sandpaper against her collarbone. She hated linen. She hated the way it wrinkled, the way it offered zero utility, the way it made her feel like an imposter in her own skin. But it was long-sleeved. And the long sleeves were non-negotiable. Down on the parade deck, the heat waves shimmered off the blacktop, turning the crisp white covers of the graduating Marines into a blinding, vibrating blur. The brass band was playing something loud and triumphant. Sousa, probably. The snare drums snapped with sharp, rhythmic cracks that echoed off the brick buildings. Crack, 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 crack. She let her eyes close for a fraction of a second. The snare drums morphed. The rhythm shifted. Suddenly it wasn't drums. It was the staccato burst of an AK-47 echoing through a concrete stairwell in Fallujah. The smell of sunscreen vanished, replaced by the copper tang of fresh blood and pulverized drywall. She opened her eyes. Hard. Her jaw ached. She'd been grinding her teeth again. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the humid, marshy air down into her lungs, grounding herself in the miserable present. She reminded herself who she was. Sarah Hayes. She was here for Danny, her kid brother. He was down there somewhere in that sea of identical, hyper-starched khaki and olive drab. He was 19 years old, practically vibrating with the kind of unblemished, naive courage that made her stomach turn. He believed in the posters. He believed in the commercials with the swords and the dragons and the crisp, clean lines of good and evil. She used to believe in them too, before the Navy found her, before she made it through the grinder in Coronado, before she became one of the few women to earn the trident, only to have it effectively stripped of all its glory the moment they went dark. They don't put women in the SEALs on the recruitment posters. They put them in the shadows. They attach them to the Black Ops units, the ones that don't officially exist, to do the things that officially never happened. Sarah scratched absent-mindedly at her left forearm, her fingernails digging into the stiff linen. Beneath the fabric, the skin was raised and jagged, a lattice of burn scars from a thermobaric grenade overlapping a very specific piece of ink. The crowd erupted into cheers as the graduating platoons executed a flawless right face. The synchronization was perfect, hundreds of boot heels striking the asphalt at the exact same millisecond. It was a beautiful, sterile piece of theatre. The woman next to her nudged her elbow. "Which one is yours?" she asked, her voice thick with a southern drawl. She pointed a French manicured finger at the mass of recruits. Sarah looked at her. The woman's eyes were bright, tearing up behind oversized designer sunglasses. She was vibrating with genuine, uncomplicated joy. Sarah felt a sudden, sharp spike of envy, followed immediately by an exhausting wave of cynicism. "Platoon 3042, Sarah said, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. She cleared her throat. "Third squad, somewhere in the middle." "Oh, you must be just bursting with pride," the woman cooed. "Yeah," Sarah said. The word tasted like ash. Bursting. She wasn't proud. Not really. She was terrified. She was looking at that sea of shiny, freshly minted Marines, and all she could see was meat. Sandbags. Kids who had no idea that the uniform they were so proud of wearing was just a target painted on their backs. She wanted to march down there, grab Danny by the scruff of his perfectly ironed collar, and drag him back to Ohio. She wanted to lock him in a basement where the world couldn't reach him with its IEDs and its politics and its endless, grinding machinery of war. But she sat there, sweating in her cheap linen shirt, because you can't save people from their own choices. She had learned that the hard way. The music swelled, hitting a crescendo that rattled the metal bleachers. The ceremony was ending. The real nightmare was about to begin. The mingling. The command for dismissal echoed over the PA system. "Dismissed!" The rigid blocks of green and khaki dissolved instantly. Hats flew into the air, a chaotic eruption of white against the hazy blue sky. The bleachers groaned as thousands of family members surged forward. A tidal wave of floral prints, khaki shorts and smartphones held aloft. Sarah didn't rush. She stayed in her seat, letting the eager masses trample past her. She hated crowds. The proximity of so many erratic, unpredictable bodies made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her eyes automatically began scanning waistlines for bulges, hands for concealed items, calculating the exits, noting the choke points. "Stop it," she told herself. "You're in South Carolina. It's a graduation. Stand down." She waited until the bleachers were mostly empty before making her way down the metal steps. The heat radiating off the parade deck hit her like a physical blow. The air down here was thick with the smell of shoe polish, sweat, and the sharp, chemical tang of dry-cleaned uniforms. She waded into the sea of reunions. There were tears everywhere. Mothers sobbing into the chests of sons who suddenly looked 5 years older. Fathers gripping shoulders with white-knuckled intensity. It was loud. Too loud. The overlapping conversations, the laughter, the crying. It all blended into a disorienting wall of white noise. "Sarah," the voice cut through the static. She turned. Pushing through a cluster of crying aunts was Danny. He looked different. The soft, doughy kid who used to steal her car keys and eat all the cereal was gone. In his place was a lean, angular stranger with a shaved head and a jawline you could cut glass on. His uniform fit him perfectly, not a single crease out of place. His brass was so polished it practically glowed. But it was his eyes that caught her off guard. They were bright, fervent. He stopped a few feet from her, as if suddenly unsure of how to greet his older sister in this new, hyper-masculine context. He half raised a hand, then dropped it. Sarah bridged the gap and pulled him into a hug. He felt like a board. His posture was so rigid it was like hugging a piece of plywood. "You look like a giant green condom, Dan," she whispered into his shoulder. She felt the tension leave his body in a sudden, jerky exhale. He let out a bark of laughter and hugged her back, his arms squeezing tight enough to crack a rib. "Jesus, Mac," he muttered, using her old call sign, a nickname from before the Navy, before everything. "You couldn't wear something nicer. You look like you're going to a Jimmy Buffett concert." She pulled back, giving him a flat look. "This is linen, idiot. It's classy. And it's hiding my weapons." He rolled his eyes, the feral marine slipping away to reveal the annoying little brother beneath. "Did Mom and Dad call?" "They're on a cruise in the Mediterranean," she reminded him. "The Wi-Fi on the ship is garbage. They said to tell you they love you, and they'll take you to dinner when you get your leave." Danny nodded, looking down at his spit-shined boots. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, quickly masked by forced stoicism. "Right. The cruise, it's fine. I'm glad you came, Sarah. Seriously." "I wouldn't miss it," she lied smoothly. She shifted her weight, the heat creeping up her legs. "So, you did it. You're a grunt." "Infantry," he corrected, puffing his chest out slightly. "Oh, 311. I ship out to Camp Geiger for SOI next week." "Thrilling." Sarah kept her face blank, though a cold knot was tightening in her stomach. "Infantry, front lines, the meat grinder. You ready for that?" "Hell yeah," he said, and he meant it. He actually meant it. "I want to get out there. I want to deploy. Do the job." She looked at him. Really looked at him. He had no idea. He thought the job was shooting bad guys and coming home to parades. He didn't know about the smell of burned hair. He didn't know what it sounded like when a 19-year-old kid bleeds out in the back of a striker, calling for a mother who is sitting on a cruise ship in the Mediterranean. "Hey," Danny said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a formal, serious tone. "My battalion commander is coming over. Square up, will you? Don't embarrass me." Sarah blinked, pulling herself out of the dark spiral. "I'm not in your military, Danny. I don't square up for anybody." "Just be cool," he hissed through a forced smile, looking past her shoulder. She turned slowly. Approaching them was a Marine officer, a colonel. He moved with that unmistakable, fluid grace of a man who had spent decades carrying weight over rough terrain. The crispness of his uniform couldn't hide the permanent, slight forward lean of a combat veteran. His hair was salt and pepper, cropped close, and his face was a topographic map of deep lines and sun damage. He was flanked by two nervous-looking junior officers, but Sarah's eyes locked onto the colonel. There was a stillness about him. The chaotic noise of the graduation crowd seemed to part around him, bouncing off an invisible perimeter. Sarah knew that stillness. She possessed that stillness. It was the mark of someone who had seen the bottom of the abyss and had simply decided to build a house there. As he got closer, the smell of cheap sunscreen and sweat faded, replaced by the faint, distinct scent of starched cotton and brass polish. "Private Reynolds," the colonel said. His voice was a low gravel rumble, quiet but commanding absolute attention. Danny snapped to attention, his heels clicking together so hard Sarah felt it in her own teeth. "Sir." "At ease, son," the colonel said. He didn't return a salute. They were indoors, or close enough to it, under the command tent's shadow, and the rules of engagement for ceremony etiquette dictated the flow. Danny relaxed, though his spine remained perfectly straight. "Congratulations, Reynolds," the colonel continued, his eyes briefly scanning Danny's uniform, assessing the polish, the fit, the bearing. "Your drill instructors spoke highly of your endurance during the crucible. Said you carried a man 60 pounds heavier than you for 3 miles. Danny flushed red. "Just doing my job, sir. Humility is a good trait. Keep it." The colonel's gaze drifted from Danny to Sarah. The shift was palpable. When he looked at Danny, he was a commander looking at a subordinate. When his eyes locked onto her, they narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. The assessment changed. He was reading her. Sarah knew what he saw. A woman in her late 20s, wearing a wrinkled, oversized linen shirt and dark sunglasses, slouching, hands shoved into her pockets. Disaffected, civilian, but she also knew what she was giving away. The way her feet were shoulder-width apart, bladed slightly. The way she wasn't fidgeting under his gaze. The complete lack of intimidation. The dead, flat stare behind her dark lenses. Real recognizes real. Predators know other predators, even when they're wearing target clearance rack linen. "Colonel Thomas Reed," he said, extending a large, calloused hand toward her. "Battalion Commander, Sarah Hayes," she replied, pulling her right hand out of her pocket. "Danny's sister." She reached out to take his hand. As she lifted her arm, the movement caught the edge of the oversized linen cuff. The fabric, damp with sweat and clinging to her skin, dragged backward. The cuff rode up her forearm. 2 inches, maybe 3. It was a split second, a microscopic window of time. Her hand met his. His grip was firm, dry and strong. She squeezed back, matching his pressure exactly, but he didn't complete the handshake. The downward pump of his arm aborted halfway through. His fingers suddenly went rigid around hers. The polite, ceremonial smile on his face didn't fade. It fractured. It shattered like a dropped mirror. His eyes had dropped to her exposed right wrist. Right there, just above the bone, protruding from the edge of the white linen, was the bottom half of her tattoo. It wasn't a standard anchor. It wasn't an eagle or a flag. It was a skull. But not a cartoonish biker skull. It was hyper-realistic, the bone cracked and fissured, wrapped in a tangle of concertina wire that dripped with stylized black ink blood. And thrust straight down through the center of the skull was the shaft of a rusted, broken trident. It was the unofficial, highly illegal, fiercely protected mark of Task Unit Cerberus. A joint task ghost element. DevGru and CIA Special Activities. A unit that technically never existed, operating out of a black site in the Korangal Valley 6 years ago. A unit that went in with 12 operators and came out with 3. Colonel Reed's breathing stopped. Sarah felt it, the sudden absolute cessation of movement in his chest. His hand, still gripping hers, turned ice cold. The blood drained from his face so fast, he looked as though he were going into shock. The tan, leathery skin of his cheeks turned a sickly, bruised grey. His pupils dilated, swallowing the iris, turning his eyes into black, empty pits. He was no longer standing on the parade deck at Paris Island. He was gone. "Sir," Danny asked, his voice wavering, sensing the sudden, catastrophic drop in barometric pressure. "Is everything all right?" Reed didn't hear him. He was staring at the ink on Sarah's wrist. The muscles in his jaw were corded tight, pulsing rhythmically. She felt a slight tremor in his hand. The great, immovable colonel was shaking. She knew why. Task Unit Cerberus didn't just fight insurgents in the Korangal. They were a cleanup crew. When conventional forces stepped in a bear trap, when a high-value asset was pinned down and screaming for air support that wasn't coming because the airspace was too hot, they called Cerberus. 6 years ago, a Marine Force recon platoon got ambushed in a mud brick village that wasn't on any map. They were cut off, surrounded, and dying. Cerberus fast roped in under the cover of a sandstorm. It was a meat grinder, close quarters, room-to-room slaughter. It took 14 hours to break the siege. Sarah remembered the smell of that village, burning plastic, cordite, and the sweet, terrible stench of roasted pork that always accompanies burning flesh. She remembered dragging a Marine captain out of a collapsed cellar. His leg was gone below the knee. He had been screaming orders until his voice gave out, holding his men together through sheer, bloody-minded force of will. She looked at Colonel Reed's face. Behind the lines and the age, behind the eagle insignia on his collar, she saw the ghost of that captain in the mud-brick cellar. He recognized the skull. He recognized the trident. He slowly raised his eyes from her wrist to her face. The sunglasses hid her eyes, but she knew he could feel the weight of her stare. "You," Reed whispered. The word barely made it past his lips. It was a fragile, broken sound, entirely unsuited for a battalion commander. "It's hot out here, Colonel," Sarah said, her voice smooth, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. She gently but firmly twisted her wrist, breaking his grip. As she pulled her hand back, she deliberately grabbed the cuff of her shirt and yanked it down, swallowing the skull, the wire, and the trident back into the darkness of the linen. Wouldn't want anyone getting heat stroke. Reed stood paralyzed. The two junior officers behind him exchanged confused, panicked glances. They didn't know what had just happened. They only knew that their commander, a man of iron and brimstone, looked like he was about to vomit. Reed started, swallowed hard, and forced his chest to expand. He tore his eyes away from her and looked at Danny. It took physical effort. She could see the muscles in his neck straining. "Reynolds, good luck at SOI. Make the corpse proud." "Yes, sir," Danny barked, completely oblivious to the silent tectonic shift that had just occurred. Reed didn't look at Sarah again. He executed a stiff, jerky pivot on his heel and walked away. He wasn't gliding anymore. He was marching, his pace frantic, pushing through the crowds of happy families, as if he were trying to escape a burning building. "Wow," Danny said, letting out a long breath. "He's intense. Usually he talks to the families for at least a few minutes. I think you intimidated him, Mac." Sarah shoved her hands back into her pockets, feeling the damp sweat on her palms. She looked out over the sea of uniforms, the brass band still playing in the distance. "Yeah, Danny," she murmured, tasting the ash in her mouth again. "I think that was it." The walk to the parking lot felt like a forced march through a convection oven. The asphalt radiated a dry, punishing heat that baked right through the thin soles of her canvas sneakers. Every step was a reminder that she was out of her element, stripped of her kit, wrapped in civilian skin that never quite fit right anymore. Danny practically floated beside her. His boots crunched on the gravel shoulder, the sound rhythmic and sharp. He was talking. He hadn't stopped talking since Colonel Reed executed his frantic about face. Danny was giving her a play-by-play of the Crucible, the 54-hour final test of recruit training. His hands moving in animated arcs, describing the obstacle courses, the sleep deprivation, the phantom hunger. And then Jenkins, this kid from Iowa, he completely freezes on the rappel tower, just locks up. Drill instructor Vargas starts screaming, veins popping out of his neck, but Jenkins is just a statue, so I had to... "Keys," Sarah interrupted, holding out her hand. They had reached her rental car, a slate-grey Hyundai Elantra that looked exactly like every other fleet vehicle in a 100-mile radius. It was an anonymous car. She liked anonymous cars. Danny blinked. His story derailed. He dug into his pocket and dropped the plastic fob into her palm. She unlocked the doors and slid into the driver's seat. The interior of the car was a blast furnace. The steering wheel burned against her palms. She cranked the engine and maxed out the air conditioning. It responded by blasting hot, stale air that smelled faintly of sour milk and chemical pine freshener directly into her face. Danny threw himself into the passenger seat, oblivious to the suffocating temperature. He was still riding the high of the parade deck, still vibrating with that terrifying, invincible energy of a 19-year-old who has just been told he is a lethal weapon. Sarah pulled out of the dirt lot, tires kicking up a cloud of pale dust. She merged onto the main drag heading toward Beaufort. The traffic was a crawl of minivans and SUVs, adorned with "Proud Marine Family" bumper stickers. "You're quiet," Danny noted, finally noticing the wall of silence she was projecting. He rolled down his window, resting his elbow on the hot plastic trim. "You didn't like the ceremony?" "It was fine, Dan. Very loud, very shiny." "You could act a little more excited. You've been staring a hole through the windshield since the colonel walked away. Did he spook you?" "Officers can be intense." Sarah let out a short, hollow exhale that was completely devoid of humor. "Yeah, that must be it. The shiny eagles on his collar really intimidated me." She kept her eyes on the road. The heat mirages dancing on the blacktop ahead looked like pools of standing water, shifting and warping the taillights of the Honda in front of them. But if she stared too long, the mirages changed. The flat Carolina highway fractured into the jagged, dusty switchbacks of the Korangal Valley. The humid air suddenly tasted like grit and diesel exhaust. She forced herself to look at the rearview mirror. Grounding exercise. 5 things she could see: the fuzzy dice hanging in the Honda, the rusted guardrail, Danny's polished belt buckle, the smudged fingerprint on the windshield, the yellow center line. 4 things she could feel: the burning leather of the steering wheel, the grit on the floor mat under her heel, the damp linen sticking to her spine, the heavy, knotted scar tissue on her right forearm pressing against the door panel. She swallowed hard, forcing the saliva down a throat that felt like it was coated in sand. The AC finally started kicking out cold air, blowing the sour milk smell to the back seat. "So, what's next?" she asked, deliberately shifting the focus back to him. She needed him talking. If he was talking, she didn't have to think. "You get a few days of leave, right? Mom left a credit card number, said to buy you a steak." Danny grinned, showing teeth. 10 days, then School of Infantry. I'm meeting up with a few of the guys from the platoon later tonight in town, actually, just for a couple of beers. You know, celebrating." "Right, celebrating." Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter. Her knuckles were bone white. She was looking at her little brother, but all she could see was a kid putting on a uniform that had cost her everything, getting ready to celebrate the privilege of stepping into the meat grinder. And somewhere on that base behind them, Colonel Thomas Reed was probably sitting in a dark office, staring at his hands, trying to figure out how a ghost from a classified slaughterhouse had just materialized in a cheap linen shirt to shake his hand. They ended up at a roadside diner off Route 21. It was a squat, cinder-block building with a neon sign that buzzed like an angry hornet and flickered on the N. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a rusted pickup truck and a semi-cab idling in the back. It was perfect, quiet, defensible. Sarah parked the Hyundai facing the highway, ensuring she had a clear line of sight to all exits. They walked inside. The blast of cold air was aggressive, smelling heavily of stale fryer grease, bleached mops, and burnt coffee. It was a working-class smell. Honest, grounding. She bypassed the hostess stand and chose a booth in the far back corner. She slid into the vinyl seat, placing her back flat against the wood-paneled wall, giving herself a panoramic view of the front door, the cash register, and the swinging doors leading to the kitchen. It was an involuntary physical routine, ingrained so deep into her muscle memory that doing anything else made her skin crawl. Danny slid into the opposite side, dropping a laminated menu onto the sticky Formica table. You always sit in the back, he muttered, picking up a salt shaker and inspecting it. Draft from the door, she lied smoothly. A waitress materialized. She looked to be in her 50s, wearing a pink uniform dress that had seen better decades. Her name tag read Barb, and she had the exhausted, heavy-lidded stare of someone who had worked 12-hour shifts since the Reagan administration. "What can I get y'all?" she asked, pulling a pencil from behind her ear. "Double bacon cheeseburger," Danny said without hesitation. "Fries, and a large Coke. Actually, make it a vanilla shake." Barb didn't write it down. She just nodded slowly and turned her tired eyes to Sarah. "Black coffee, dry rye toast," Sarah said. Danny frowned. "That's it. Mac, you look like you've lost 10 pounds since Christmas. Eat a burger." "My stomach doesn't do well with grease in this heat," she replied. Keeping her tone flat to shut down the debate, Barb shuffled away. Danny leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The sleeves of his dress shirt were rolled up, revealing forearms that were starting to look hard and ropey. "So," he started, a slight edge of condescension creeping into his voice. The new Marine, ready to interrogate the civilian. "How's the logistics business? Still pushing spreadsheets in Virginia? Logistics consultant for the Department of Defense." That was the cover story. The neatly packaged lie the Navy had constructed for her when she got drafted into the dark stuff. It explained the long absences, the odd hours, the physical conditioning, and the fact that she lived in a bleak apartment near Langley. "It's fine," Sarah said. "Supply chain optimization. Exciting stuff. We recently streamlined the procurement process for heavy machinery parts, saved the taxpayers 4%. The lie rolled off her tongue like water off glass. She had recited it so many times she almost bored herself. Danny rolled his eyes, taking a sip of the ice water Barb had dropped off. "Sounds thrilling. I don't know how you do it, Sarah. Sitting in a cubicle all day, staring at screens. Don't you ever want to do something that actually matters?" The words hung in the air between them. Something that matters? She looked at his earnest, unscarred face. She thought about the 3 men she had dragged out of a burning helicopter in Yemen while taking small arms fire to her ceramic plates. She thought about the target in Mogadishu who had stopped breathing with her hands around his throat, his blood warm and sticky on her forearms. She thought about the skull and trident burned into her skin, marking her as a member of a brotherhood that officially did not exist, a unit that carried the nation's darkest sins so kids like Danny could believe in shiny medals. She picked up a paper napkin and began folding it. Halves, quarters, eighths. "Somebody has to make sure the machinery parts arrive on time, Dan," she said softly. Before he could respond, a busboy emerging from the kitchen collided with a waitress carrying a stack of ceramic plates. Crash. The sound was sharp, violent and deafening in the quiet diner. It sounded exactly like the crack of a supersonic 7.62 round impacting concrete. Her conscious brain knew she was in South Carolina. Her autonomic nervous system was back in the Korangal. She didn't think. She moved. In a fraction of a second, she was out of the booth. Her right hand swept back, clearing the tail of her linen shirt, her fingers wrapping around the cold, textured grip of the compact 9mm she carried, appendix inside the waistband. She didn't draw it, the safety retention held, but her hand was there, thumb indexing the slide. Her body had instantly dropped low, blading away from the threat vector, left arm coming up to protect her face and neck. She froze in a half-crouch, every muscle in her body coiled tight as a watch spring. Adrenaline flooded her system, turning her vision into a hyper-focused tunnel. She stared at the kitchen doors. There was no insurgent. There was no muzzle flash. just a terrified teenager in an apron, staring down at shattered plates and a puddle of brown gravy. The diner went dead silent. Barb, behind the counter, was staring at her. The truck driver in the corner was staring at her. And Danny. Danny was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, a look of profound confusion wiping away the arrogant marine bravado. He was looking at her hand, buried under her shirt at her waistline. He was looking at the way she was standing, a perfect, aggressive combat stance that you don't learn from optimizing supply chains. The adrenaline began to recede, replaced instantly by a cold, sickening wave of realization. Sarah forced herself to stand up straight. She slowly pulled her empty right hand from under her shirt, brushing a non-existent piece of lint from her jeans. She let out a nervous, manufactured chuckle. "Wow," she said, her voice shaky. She forced her hand to tremble slightly as she reached for her water glass. That was loud. Startled the hell out of me. Dropped my napkin. She stooped down and picked up the heavily creased napkin from the floor, tossing it onto the table. She slid back into the booth, keeping her eyes downcast, playing the embarrassed civilian. Danny didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at her. His eyes tracked the line of her shoulders, the way she held her hands. The innocence was suddenly fighting a losing battle against his brand-new tactical training. He was putting pieces together. Slowly, but they were moving. "You move fast for a logistics consultant, Mac," he said quietly. "I do yoga," she replied, taking a sip of her black coffee. It tasted like battery acid. Barb arrived with the food, breaking the tension. Danny attacked his burger with the ferocity of a starving man. But the atmosphere in the booth had fractured. The careless banter was gone. He kept glancing at her waistline. She kept staring at the door. They were both waiting for something to happen. She just knew exactly what she was waiting for. The motel was a 2-story concrete block painted a depressing shade of seafoam green. The neon sign out front advertised color TV and free ice. The air conditioner in room 114 rattled like a dying lawnmower, failing miserably to cut through the oppressive humidity that had settled over the swampy coastal town. It was 8 p.m. Danny had taken the rental car an hour ago. He had changed out of his dress uniform and into jeans and a tight t-shirt that showed off his new boot camp physique. He was meeting Jenkins and a few other newly minted killers at a bar near the waterfront. She told him to have fun, gave him $50, and told him to take an Uber if he drank too much. The moment the tail lights disappeared down the road, Sarah locked the deadbolt, threw the security latch, and drew the heavy, dust-smelling blackout curtains. Alone, finally. She stood in the center of the room, listening to the rattle of the AC unit. The stale smell of decades of cigarette smoke clung to the polyester bedspread. It wasn't home, but it was a defensible box. She moved to the bathroom. The fluorescent tube above the sink flickered, casting a sickly green pallor over the tiny room. She stared into the mirror. Her eyes looked hollow, ringed with dark shadows that no amount of sleep could fix. She unbuttoned the linen shirt, stripping it off and throwing it onto the floor. She stood in her sports bra and jeans. Without the oversized fabric hiding her frame, the map of her history was visible. The jagged, silvered shrapnel scar cutting across her left collarbone. The smooth, shiny patch of a bullet graze on her right oblique and the right forearm. She ran her thumb over the raised, knotted tissue of the thermobaric burn. Beneath the ruined skin, the black ink of the Cerberus skull stared back at her, the broken trident mocking her. Her joints ached, a deep, bone-deep throb that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The sudden movement at the diner had aggravated her lower back, a souvenir from a hard landing on a rooftop in Sana'a. She turned on the tap, splashing cold water on her face. She needed to sleep. She needed to reset. Tomorrow she had to play the proud sister for one more day, drop Danny at the airport, and fly back to the grey oblivion of Virginia. Knock, knock. Sarah froze. Water dripped from her chin into the porcelain sink. It wasn't a frantic knock. It wasn't the rhythmic, impatient tapping of a 19-year-old kid who forgot his room key. It was two heavy, deliberate strikes of a closed fist against the cheap, hollow core door. Knock, knock. Her training bypassed her conscious thought entirely. She moved silently out of the bathroom, stepping lightly on the balls of her feet to avoid the creaking floorboards. She reached into her canvas duffel bag on the bed and pulled out a matte black folding knife, flicking the 3-inch steel blade open with her thumb. She didn't grab the 9mm. If it was local cops, a gun was a bad idea. If it was an intruder at this range, the blade was faster. She pressed her back against the wall next to the door, keeping her body out of the fatal funnel of the doorway. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice flat, carrying no tremor. Silence from the hallway, just the hum of the ice machine a few doors down. Then a low, gravelly voice. Exhausted. Defeated. "Open the door, Petty Officer Hayes," or whatever rank they gave you when they buried you. She closed her eyes. She let the back of her head rest against the cheap wallpaper for 1 second. Then she reached over, disengaged the chain, flipped the deadbolt, and opened the door, keeping her right hand with the knife concealed behind her leg. Colonel Thomas Reed stood in the humid breezeway. He was out of his dress uniform, wearing dark jeans and a plain grey polo shirt. In civilian clothes, the illusion of the invincible battalion commander was gone. He looked smaller, older. The lines on his face were deeper, etched with a fatigue that went far beyond physical exhaustion. In his right hand, he held a brown paper bag, the shape of a square bottle pressed against the paper. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her bare right arm, exposed without the linen shirt. He stared at the ruined skin, the skull, the wire, the trident. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. "I needed to know," Reed said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to know I wasn't losing my mind." Sarah didn't move. She kept the doorway blocked. "You're a long way from base, Colonel. I tracked the rental car," he said, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers. There was no hostility in his gaze, just a desperate, hollow pleading. "I pulled the gate logs, used some favors with the MPs. I had to find you." "Why?" she asked coldly. "Because 6 years ago, I watched 3 ghosts walk out of a burning village carrying my wounded. They didn't have names, they didn't have faces, they wore balaclavas and sterile gear. But one of them, the one who dragged me out of that cellar by my tactical vest while taking incoming fire, the sleeve of her combat shirt was torn." Reed took a ragged breath. The heavy, oppressive heat of the Carolina night seemed to press down on him, crushing his shoulders. "I saw the ink," he whispered. "A skull wrapped in wire, a broken trident. I saw it right before I passed out from blood loss. For 6 years, the Pentagon told me I hallucinated it. Force Recon Command told me a quick reaction force of Rangers pulled us out. They told me there were no women on that ridge. They told me Cerberus didn't exist." He lifted the brown paper bag slightly. "I brought bourbon," he said. The gravel in his voice cracked. "Please, tell me I'm not crazy." Sarah looked at this man. A Marine colonel with eagles on his collar. A man who commanded hundreds of lethal young men like her brother. standing outside a two-star motel, begging a ghost for validation. She looked down at the knife in her hand. She folded the blade shut with a soft click and tossed it onto the bed behind her. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "You're not crazy, Thomas," she said quietly, using his first name, stripping away the rank, leaving only the reality of the dirt and the blood they shared. "Come inside." He stepped over the threshold. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing them in the green-lit, cigarette-stained box. Two casualties of a war that never happened, alone with the ghosts. The door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid home with a heavy, metallic thud that sounded entirely too loud in the cramped space. Colonel Thomas Reed stood near the foot of the sagging queen bed. He looked entirely out of place. The Akano Lodge was a monument to transient failure, a room defined by cheap veneer and despair. Reed was a man of pressed uniforms, oak-panelled offices, and rigid, unyielding order. But right now, his shoulders were slumped. The formidable aura that had parted the crowds on the parade deck was completely gone, leaving behind an exhausted 50-something man in a grey polo shirt. He walked over to the small circular table by the window. The laminate surface was bubbling at the edges. He set the brown paper bag down and pulled out a bottle of Woodford Reserve. "Do you have glasses?" he asked. His voice was scraped hollow. Sarah walked into the bathroom, retrieved 2 plastic cups wrapped in thin, crinkling cellophane, and brought them back. She stripped the plastic off and set them on the table. Reed unscrewed the cap. His hands were trembling. Not a slight tremor, but a harsh, jerky vibration. The heavy glass neck of the bottle clattered against the rim of the cheap plastic cup as he poured. 2 fingers of amber liquid in his, 2 in hers. He didn't offer a toast. He picked up his cup and drank half of it in a single swallow. He closed his eyes as the alcohol hit his stomach, taking a slow, ragged breath through his nose. She took her cup but didn't drink. She leaned her hip against the edge of the low dresser, crossing her arms over her chest, keeping her right hand resting near her waistline out of habit. "The Pentagon told me it was a Ranger QRF," Reed said, his eyes still closed. "They showed me the after-action reports, black text on white paper, signed by generals. It detailed the Rangers pushing up the valley, laying down suppressive fire, extracting us under the cover of Apache gunships." He opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, the whites laced with angry red veins. "But I remember the dust," he whispered. "I remember the radio going dead. I remember my radio man, Corporal Miller, taking a round through the throat. I remember the smell of it, copper and shit and burning diesel from the generator. We were pinned in that cellar for 6 hours. We were out of ammo. I had my sidearm out. I was trying to decide if I should save the last round for myself or use it on the doorway." Sarah remained perfectly still. The AC unit rattled behind her, blowing stale, frigid air against her bare shoulders. "And then," Reed continued, his gaze drifting past her, locking onto a water stain on the wall as if it were a projection screen. "The wall exploded, not the door, the back wall, a shaped charge. The concussive force blew my eardrums, and through the dust and the brick dust, 3 people walked in. They didn't look like Rangers. They didn't have unit patches. They wore sterile gear, suppressed short-barreled rifles, 4-tube night vision." He looked at her then, his eyes locked onto hers, pleading for the anchor of reality. "You moved like water," he said. "No screaming, no frantic orders, just surgical execution. You killed the 2 insurgents who breached the stairwell in less than a second. Headshots, both. Then one of you, a massive guy with a belt-fed machine gun, held the breach. The second one started triaging my wounded. And you." He pointed a shaking finger at her. You grabbed the drag strap on the back of my plate carrier. I tried to tell you to leave me. My femur was shattered. I was dead weight. But you leaned down, put your face an inch from mine, and told me to shut the fuck up. Sarah looked down at the amber liquid in her plastic cup. The memory was a physical weight in the room, pressing against her chest. You were bleeding out, Thomas, she said quietly. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, flat, resigned. Your tourniquet was loose. I reapplied it, ripped the sleeve of my combat shirt, doing it on the jagged rebar sticking out of the wall. Reed let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. It was the sound of a man who had carried a crushing, invisible boulder for 6 years and had suddenly been allowed to set it down. The ink, he breathed. I saw the ink when you tightened the windlass on the tourniquet, the skull, the wire. Cerberus, Sarah said. The word tasted like copper on her tongue. She hated saying it out loud. It felt like breaking a blood oath. Task Unit Cerberus. We were operating out of a CIA black site, 10 clicks south of your position. We were hunting a high-value target. When we intercepted your broken Mayday call, we knew conventional QRF was 2 hours out. You had 20 minutes. Why did they lie? Reed asked, his voice hardening, a flicker of the colonel returning. Why write a phantom AAR? Because our presence in that valley was highly illegal, Thomas. We were operating across a border we officially weren't supposed to cross, targeting individuals we officially weren't supposed to know about. If it came out that a Black Ops Navy element saved a Marine recon platoon, the geopolitical fallout would have been catastrophic. So the Rangers got the medals, you got a sanitized narrative, and Cerberus ceased to exist. She took a slow sip of the bourbon. It burned on the way down, a sharp, clean fire that momentarily cut through the chill of the room. We didn't all walk out, she added, her voice dropping an octave. The guy holding the breech with the belt fed. His name was Elias. He took an RPG fragment to the neck covering our exfil to the Blackhawks. We left his blood in that dirt right next to your Marines. Reed stared at his cup. His knuckles were white. He was a commander. He understood acceptable losses. He understood the butcher's bill. But understanding it and living with the fact that someone else paid your tab were two entirely different realities. I owe you my life, Reed said, the words heavy, absolute. You don't owe me a goddamn thing, she snapped, the sudden surge of anger surprising her. Her grip on the plastic cup tightened until the sides bowed inward. You survived. That's the only currency that matters. You got to come home, pin eagles on your collar, and tell kids like my brother how glorious it is to die for a piece of cloth. Don't put me on a pedestal, Colonel. We were the monsters they sent in when the politicians didn't want to get their hands dirty. There is no honor in what I did, only survival. Reed slowly stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't offer platitudes. He possessed the rare, grim wisdom of a man who knew when the truth was too ugly to dress up. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy, dull silver coin, and placed it on the laminate table next to the bottle. It was his battalion commander's challenge coin. I'm not putting you on a pedestal, Sarah, he said quietly. I'm just acknowledging the ghost. I'm going to walk out of this room, and I am never going to mention this again. I will pretend I never saw your arm. I will pretend you are a logistics consultant. But if you or your brother ever need anything, the door is open. He turned and walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the brass knob, and looked back over his shoulder. He's a good kid, Reed said softly. He believes in it. Don't take that from him yet. Let him have the illusion a little longer. Reality will find him soon enough. He opened the door and stepped out into the stifling Carolina night. The door clicked shut, leaving her alone with a half-empty bottle of bourbon, a plastic cup, and a silver coin that felt as heavy as a tombstone. The digital clock on the bedside table read 2:43 in glowing, bloody red numbers. Sarah was lying on top of the covers, fully clothed except for her shoes. The TV was on, muted. An infomercial for a blender played in a continuous cheerful loop, casting frantic flashes of blue and white light across the ceiling. She hadn't slept. She hadn't even closed her eyes. The adrenaline from the diner and the emotional exhaustion from Reed's visit had created a toxic, vibrating cocktail in her bloodstream. She heard the heavy, boots-on-concrete footsteps in the breezeway long before the keycard slid into the electronic lock. The mechanism whirred, clicked, and the door swung open. Danny stood in the threshold. He didn't look drunk, but he looked altered. His face was flushed, his eyes slightly glazed, carrying the distinct scent of cheap draft beer, stale cigarette smoke from a dive bar patio, and the sharp, ozone smell of an impending thunderstorm. He kicked the door shut behind him. He didn't drop his keys on the dresser. He didn't take off his boots. He just stood there, staring at her in the dim light of the TV. Sarah sat up slowly, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. She planted her feet flat on the thin carpet, keeping her posture relaxed but grounded. "Have fun?" she asked. Her voice was calm, conversational. Danny didn't answer immediately. His eyes tracked over to the small circular table. The brown paper bag, the bottle of Woodford Reserve, the 2 plastic cups, the silver challenge coin glinting in the blue light of the television. He walked over to the table. He picked up the coin. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the raised insignia, the heavy weight of the metal. He knew what it was. Every Marine knew what it was. "Colonel Reed was here," Danny said. It wasn't a question. "He stopped by," she replied. "Battalion commanders don't stop by the Okono Lodge at midnight to drink bourbon with the sister of a private," Danny said. The beer was making him brave. Or maybe it was just the realization that his entire perception of his family dynamic had shattered somewhere between the appetizer course at the diner and his third beer at the bar. He dropped the coin back onto the table. The metallic clink was sharp and angry. "Jenkins thought I was crazy," Danny said, his voice rising, the youthful bravado warring with genuine confusion. "I tried to explain to them what happened at the diner, how you moved. I tried to demonstrate the stance you took. Jenkins's older brother is a cop. He said it sounded like a modified Weaver. He said it sounded like someone who clears rooms for a living." Sarah sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. A dull headache was beginning to throb behind her left eye. "Danny, you're drunk. Go to bed. We have an early flight." "No." He took a step toward her. His hands were balled into fists at his sides. He wasn't aggressive, but he was demanding. "No more bullshit, Sarah. No more supply chain optimization. No more I do yoga. You dropped into a combat crouch faster than my drill instructors. And then my battalion commander looks at you like he's seen a ghost, tracks you down to a motel, and leaves his personal coin on your table." He pointed a finger at her, his voice cracking slightly. "Who the hell are you?" She looked at him. Really looked at him. He was 19. He had a freshly shaved head, a chest full of naive pride, and absolutely no idea how dark the world actually was. She had spent the last 6 years building a wall of lies to protect him from that darkness. She wanted him to believe in the good guys and the bad guys. She wanted him to believe that the system worked. But looking at him now, she realized the lie wasn't protecting him. It was just making him blind. And blind men die quickly in the meat grinder. Sarah stood up. She didn't rush. She moved deliberately, pulling the hem of her grey t-shirt up and over her head in one fluid motion, tossing it onto the foot of the bed. She stood before him in her sports bra and jeans. Danny's mouth parted slightly. His eyes immediately went to the silver, jagged furrow running across her left collarbone, then to the puckered, shiny indent on her right oblique, and finally to her right forearm. In the stark, shifting light of the television, the tattoo was violently clear. The hyper-realistic cracked skull, the black, dripping concertina wire, the rusted, broken trident driven through the bone. Framed by the raised, melted texture of the thermobaric burn scar, Danny stopped breathing. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, chilling shock. He took a half step back, his eyes wide, tracing the lines of the scars, trying to process the physical evidence of extreme violence on the body of his older sister. "I lied to you," Sarah said. Her voice was perfectly flat, devoid of emotion, the voice of the operator. "I'm not a logistics consultant. I haven't been since 2018. What is that?" he whispered, nodding toward the skull. "It's the mark of a unit that doesn't exist. Task Unit Cerberus. We were attached to Naval Special Warfare, cross-decked with the agency. We did the things they don't put in the recruitment videos, Danny. We did the wet work, the night raids, the assassinations. We cleaned up the messes that conventional forces couldn't handle, and then we scrubbed the records so the politicians could sleep at night." Danny stared at her. He was shaking his head slowly, rejecting the data. "But you're a woman. Women weren't in combat roles. They weren't in SEAL teams. Officially," she corrected him. "Officially, I was a supply officer pushing paper in Bahrain. Unofficially, I spent 4 years kicking in doors in places you can't find on a map. I've killed more men than your entire boot camp platoon ever will. And I lost people. Good people. People who died screaming in the dirt for a cause that changed, depending on what the news cycle needed." She walked over to the table, picked up the challenge coin, and held it out to him. "Colonel Reed was in the Korangal Valley 6 years ago," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "His platoon got ambushed. They were cut off, bleeding out, and the military was going to let them die because extracting them would have caused an international incident. My unit was in the area. We went in. We broke the siege. I pulled Colonel Reed out of a burning cellar. That's why he looked at me like a ghost, because to the rest of the world, I am one." Danny looked from the coin to her face. The illusion was gone. The crisp, clean lines of his Marine Corps reality were dissolving into the grey, bloody truth of her existence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. His voice was small. He sounded like the kid who used to steal her car keys again. "Because I wanted you to stay clean," she said. She dropped the coin onto the table. She picked up her t-shirt and pulled it back on, hiding the map of violence, retreating back into the civilian shell. "I wanted you to have a normal life. I wanted you to go to college, to get a boring job, to complain about traffic, but you had to join up." She walked back to the bed and sat down. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a bone-deep weariness. "You think you're ready for this, Danny?" she said softly, staring at the floor. "You think because you survived the crucible, you know what war is. You don't. War isn't a test of strength. It's a test of how much of your soul you can carve out and leave in the dirt while still keeping your heart beating. It's smelling burning hair. It's watching your friends bleed to death while you try to hold their intestines inside their body. It's coming home and realizing the people you fought for don't care, don't understand, and don't want to hear about it." Danny stood there in silence. The muted infomercial flashed across his face. "I'm a Marine," he finally said, though the absolute certainty was gone. It sounded like a question. I took an oath. I know, she said. She looked up at him. And I respect that. But don't you ever, ever mistake the uniform for invincibility. You listen to your gut. You keep your head on a swivel. And when the shooting starts, you forget about the flag, you forget about the corps, and you fight for the man next to you. Because when the machine breaks down, that's all you have left. Danny swallowed hard. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask any more questions. He didn't ask how many people she had killed. He didn't ask about the burn scar. He just walked over to his bed, took off his boots, and lay down, staring at the ceiling in the dark. They didn't speak for the rest of the night. But the silence wasn't a wall anymore. It was an understanding. The Carolina morning broke like a fever dream. By 8 a.m., the air was already thick and viscous, a humid blanket that clung to the skin and made the lungs work twice as hard. The drive to the Savannah/Hilton Head International Airport was quiet. The radio in the rental Hyundai played a low, murmuring country station, providing a baseline of static noise to fill the heavy silence in the car. Danny sat in the passenger seat. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a plain grey t-shirt, but his posture was rigid, his back perfectly straight, his eyes scanning the tree lines blurring past the window. He was a boot Marine now. The training was baked into his muscle memory. But his eyes were different. The fervent, unquestioning brightness from the parade deck had been tempered. There was a shadow there now. The shadow of the Korangal, the shadow of Cerberus. Sarah kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the burning steering wheel. She wore a long-sleeved, lightweight cotton shirt, blue jeans, canvas sneakers, the uniform of the invisible. Her 9mm was securely locked inside her checked Pelican case in the trunk, declared and neutralized for the flight. She felt naked without it. They pulled into the departure lane. The terminal was a chaotic mess of idling taxis, frustrated families, and the sharp scent of aviation fuel mixing with the humid swamp air. She put the car in park and popped the trunk. They got out and walked to the back of the car. Danny hauled his heavy olive-drab duffel bag out, hoisting it over his shoulder with effortless grace. She pulled out her smaller black canvas bag. They stood on the concrete curb as a massive passenger bus wheezed past, blowing a wave of hot exhaust over them. This was it, the divergence point. He was flying to North Carolina for the School of Infantry. She was flying back to Washington, D.C., back to the grey cubicles and the classified briefings and the endless, silent watch over the geopolitical chessboard. "Well," Danny said, adjusting the strap of his duffel. He looked at the sliding glass doors of the terminal, then down at his boots. "Thanks for coming, Sarah. Seriously, even if it was complicated." "I wouldn't have missed it, Dan," she said. He looked up at her. The boyishness was stripping away, revealing the man the Marine Corps was forging. But for a second, just a brief, vulnerable second, the little brother broke through. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "Living with it? Living with what you did?" She looked past him, watching a family pile out of a minivan, laughing, oblivious, perfectly safe in their bubble of ignorance. That was why she did it. That was why Cerberus existed, so they could laugh. "I survive it," she told him honestly. "That has to be enough." He nodded, accepting the answer. He dropped his duffel bag and stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her. She hugged him back. She didn't feel the rigid plywood Marine this time. She felt her brother. She felt the steady, strong beat of his heart against her chest. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of coastal salt and cheap laundry detergent. "Keep your head down, Danny," she whispered fiercely into his ear. "Don't be a hero, just be a survivor. You hear me?" "I hear you, Mac," he murmured, He pulled back. He gave her a sharp, brief nod, a gesture of respect that transcended rank and branch. It was one operator acknowledging another. Then he picked up his duffel bag, turned, and walked through the sliding glass doors into the terminal. Sarah watched him go until the crowd swallowed him up. A young man walking into the machine. She stood on the curb for a long moment, the heat pressing down on her shoulders. She reached up and absent-mindedly rubbed the thick fabric of her long sleeve, right over the hidden, ruined skin of her forearm. The skull and the trident were quiet today. Colonel Reed had his closure. Danny had his truth. She turned around, grabbed the handle of her black duffel bag, and walked toward the entrance. She had a flight to catch. The world wasn't going to save itself in the dark, and her leave was officially over. Some wars end with a treaty, and some end in a cheap motel room over a plastic cup of bourbon. Sarah finally laid her ghost to rest, but now Danny marches toward his own crucible, carrying the heavy truth of his sister's shadow. The invisible line between hero and monster is razor thin. How do you think Danny will handle the meat grinder now that his eyes are wide open? If this story hit you hard, hit that like button, share this video to spread the truth, and subscribe for more grounded, gritty storytelling. Stay safe out there.